All right, so welcome everybody to our DataBytes session for today. We are extremely excited for today's conversation because Fermin and I are going to use you all as willing participants in testing out our presentation that we'll be delivering next week to the Strategic Data Project folks who have been coordinating our research fellowship that we've been engaged in for the last 18 months or so. Um, this is kind of our culminating capstone presentation to bookend our work with the Strategic Data Project, which is housed within Harvard's Center for Education Policy Research. Um, and it is focused on work that we have been doing alongside the advising team and others throughout the last several years, really, but really with focused efforts on implementation projects that have been underway over the last 9 months or so. So let me share my screen. We've got some slides prepared that we're going to be using to frame up the conversation, and then we will jump into it. That's not what I want. You guys are probably seeing the presenter slides, huh? I almost never use PowerPoint anymore, kind of for this reason. So bear with me. I know this isn't like an official presentation format, but hope you all can give me some grace. I don't want the screen to get cluttered up with other things. Okay, so as I mentioned, Fermin and I have been hard at work alongside many other contributors, which we'll acknowledge kind of at the end, over the last 18 months or so in engaging with Harvard Center for Education Policy Research and a spinoff group of that called the Strategic Data Project, who helps teams across K-12 and higher ed to engage in data projects to strengthen their student outcomes and better understand the dynamics of their organizations. We're going to be presenting on our capstone project today entitled From Insights to Action, Implementing a Predictive Model for Student Success. And to give you a little bit of background on this, we've been kind of hard at work for a few years now in developing an internally developed predictive data model to help us understand students' likelihood of persisting from one term to the next. Under Fermin's leadership, we've developed this model and we've gotten feedback from a lot of folks along the way to help to identify how likely are students to transition from their current semester of enrollment into the following semester based on a lot of patterns that we can collect data on in their engagement with relearn and their academic history with the college. Our study was really focused on the implementation of this work in practice and kind of navigating the change management process that's needed as we co-developed an early alert framework with the academic advising team. Our objective on this as kind of the developers was to increase readiness among our advising staff here at the college and try and cultivate greater usage of the data and the insights that are generated from the data model to really help to drive student outcomes. Within this study, we were seeking to inform the development of similar initiatives that other institutions might undertake, especially for colleges and universities who might be looking at developing their own internally developed model, where they might find that kind of off-the-shelf models might not fit the specific nuances of their student population, which is a challenge that we were overcoming in the early phases of all this work. So in order to achieve kind of those broad objectives, our study, and for the purposes of the capstone, was focused on kind of three primary areas of concentration. One, we wanted to build trust among our project stakeholders, namely advisors who are the primary end users of the data model in kind of this pilot phase, as well as our faculty, making sure that they were informed of and supportive of the intervention work because it did require a lot of conversations about students' experience in the classroom. We are also designing reporting and data tools that advisors could use in their daily routines and their kind of daily workflow. And then we are working through obvious questions and concerns related to the use of these types of predictive models and how the efficacy of that model was perceived among the users of the data. So the findings that we're going to highlight for you today kind of underscore the importance of a collaborative approach in this type of work and the need for really rigorous and consistent feedback between the developers of the data tools and the users so that we can successfully integrate kind of those insights from the analytics into the daily operations of the institution. And for me, I'm going to kick it over to you to help us better understand the problem that we were trying to solve here.
Okay. Yeah. As we know, Rio Salado basically has a population of non-traditional students, has some dual enrollment, right? And we serve about, let's say, 40,000 students a year, roughly. So we know that the problem of students going into the following term is a serious one, right? But half don't go into the following term. So when we came up with this idea, we decided to look at what factors could be impacting the decision whether or not to continue into the following term. So we had some prior experience with a vendor where we came to the conclusion that things were not working the way we intended. And that's when we took it upon ourselves to develop this initiative, right? And the whole purpose was, as usual, developing a model. It's a good mental exercise, but it's only half of the equation. The other second half of the equation is how do we, once the model is developed and deployed, how is it operationally it's gonna work, right? To make a difference on the problem that we face at hand. So this is where the efforts to interact with advisors came in, right? We know from a previous literature, and from the experience that we had with RioPace, that there were some credibility issues. And this is why the approach that we took in terms of uh, having advisors fill up a survey 3 times during the process was intended to kind of align the perceptions and eliminate doubts or diminish their impact and get their buy-in, not only from them, but maybe from the rest of the community in the college. Can we go to the next slide? Can we go into the next one, please? Oh,
Yeah, I think it's up there. There you go.
okay, right. So if we dig a little bit deeper under the weeds, then we'll say, okay, what goes into this secret recipe, right? Which is basically how do we build a model or how do I build a model, you know? And the whole idea initially is we have a set of attributes that we do analysis on, right? It could be logins, it could be engagements, it could be academic load, it could be cumulative credits in the whole Maricopa system. It could be demographics, right? Like whether the student is a first generation or not. At what time did he come in into the college? What background did he have when he came in? And all these attributes were considered, and eventually we built two models. We have one which is the initial one, a logistic regression, and now we have a second one which is a little bit more complicated and it has more attributes than the initial one, right? So the whole idea is these models run daily and generate predictions, right? Generate what we call prediction probability scores. So we have, like, if we want to talk about how students get classified, right? We have very low, low, medium, high, and very high. And these categories get a color. So a very low will get a red, a low will get an orange, a medium will get a yellow, a high will get, let me see, a blue, and very high will get a green. So that's what's encompassed. So when advisors go into the system, they will see whether the student has one of these indicators, and based on that, he might decide to take an action, right? Either it could be a phone call or it could be just another type of action, right? Intended to what? Intended to detect whether the student is having issues. Could be academic, it could be personal issues that might not allow him to continue with their academic pursuits. So that's in general, that's pretty much the whole idea, right? So on the front end, there are reports that the rest of the team generates, so advisors know how many cases they need to tackle, right? And they get distributed according to how the internal process of advising works. And the whole process is, like I said, to make them take an action, to talk with the students, and get a sense for whether the student has issues or not. So we're going to the next one, and the next one you probably be better off if you talk
Yep.
about that.
Thanks, Fermin. Yeah, and so, this is helpful for our internal Rio audience here, but kind of in full disclosure, when we initially entered into this research fellowship, our intent was to study the effectiveness of the model itself and to
Oh,
understand whether or not the prediction scores were working as intended and if the interventions were driving success outcomes in the way we envisioned. Now, I won't go into the weeds of this, but the parameters of the study and the timelines changed. And so as a result of that, we kind of shifted gears. And that's where I'll circle us back into our slides here and center us back on what we then were working towards in terms of the approach for this particular project and the data that we generated as a result. So once we decided that we needed to focus on implementation and really kind of the change management practice necessary to incorporate this type of information into the day-to-day workflow and operations of the advisors at the college, we devised a couple of different ways in which we were going to understand the effectiveness of that and whether or not we were making an impact over the duration of our project phase. So there were two things that we looked at. One is that we developed a study, or excuse me, a survey that we administered to the advisors throughout the duration of the study. We did this at kind of key implementation phases or key phases of the work, once prior to really formal training and coaching that we delivered to help them better understand the predictive model and how to go about using it. Then we ran it again right before the work really kind of kicked off in earnest, starting at the beginning of the fall 24 semester. Advisors started incorporating the predictive scores into their weekly workflows and prioritizing outreach based on that. And so we took another snapshot of data at that point, and then once more at the end of the fall semester, kind of like right after Thanksgiving, to understand how well it went and to gauge whether or not there were changes in kind of attitude and sentiments over time. So the survey that we developed it contained 15 different questions, and we adapted it from the American Institutes of Research's Stages of Concern, Innovation, Adoption model, which is a framework that they have published on their website to help understand the effectiveness of a change management approach similar to the one that we are engaged in. And it helped us to collect feedback on a few different themes, which we'll review together here over the next couple of slides. One was understanding of the data model and the tools that were affiliated with it. Another was readiness for change. A third was the concept of interacting with students and how well that work was progressing. And then the fourth was the impact of the work, or how I have it labeled on a future slide is the impact to students. Um, I mentioned how we incorporated it. And then alongside that, we also consistently were visiting the advisors like weekly um, meetings. We didn't go every week, but every other month or so we visited. We had kind of a focus group and interview, kind of a session where we would collect additional kind of qualitative feedback from them to better understand what their needs were around this, and so that we could help to continue to refine resources along the way. In addition to the survey data, we also then were monitoring how usage was progressing over time. So as you all are familiar with Rio Compass, as advisors are going in and charting their interactions with students, they were taking notes based on their intervention work that was informed by the predictive data model. And so then we were watching those trends evolve over time so that we could demonstrate whether or not um, an increase in usage was at all associated with kind of the attitudes that we were seeing as the study progressed. So diving into the survey data, this first set of questions that we're highlighting includes the survey items that are related to advisors' understanding of the predictive model and then the resources that we developed in relation to that. So throughout the study, we delivered some training and coaching around the initial phase of implementation to really help to orient the end users to the data model, helping them understand that slide that Fermine shared earlier, like what were the features and the variables that are incorporated into the model? What are the resources that we had available to help them better understand predictive modeling, just kind of in general, and then how it could be used and put into practice in kind of day-to-day operations. So over the period of the study, we saw some pretty significant improvements in advisors' understanding of the model itself, and then the reporting that we developed to help them to interact with the scores. Across all the questions that were kind of included within this theme, we saw some level of improvement in average survey scores, especially from the time of kind of early implementation in May through to the end of the cycle. Now, I will kind of call out here that we didn't collect as much of a full sample of data within that kind of midstream data collection period. As we went back and looked at that, I'm not entirely sure what happened. We just didn't get full participation like we did in those other two data points. So I did want to show the data. I didn't want to kind of exclude it from the analysis, but that August data collection point, we have some concerns about the reliability of that data, and we're focusing more on kind of the growth that we saw from initial survey point in May through to that final survey point in November. Um, so following that initial training back in May, we did see that scores on survey questions related to finding the relevant data that they needed to conduct outreach, identifying students who were kind of eligible or who should be intervened with, and then locating the support materials all saw some pretty noteworthy increases. For example, we saw advisors' understanding of how to identify students who were resulting from the predictions. Average scores out of 7 increased from 4.7 to 6.5. And so that kind of helped us to understand that that initial coaching and training that we did have some measurable impact on kind of readiness and understanding of the data. However, we did see some pretty significant variability in the data that we collected across the duration of the study. And so we're interpreting that to mean that there's still continued coaching around the predictive model itself that's needed and continue to reinforce how insights that could be derived from the model can affect in a positive way student success outcomes. Um, this next kind of bucket of survey data that we looked at are related to advisors' readiness for change and implementation of the data model in their daily routines. So the feedback that we collected from advisors here, both in the survey and through the focus groups that we conducted, helped us to understand how best to incorporate the data model into the reports and the resources that we knew advisors were using in their daily interactions with students. We've got a catalog of reports that advisors are using to identify the students who fall under their caseload. And then we also were able finally to get some of the data incorporated into Rio Compass so that when advisors are in that platform, they can see quickly a student's predictive score so that they can use that to frame their conversations as they're interacting with students. So throughout the study, we continuously kind of refined that. We collected additional feedback via the survey and through focus groups on what was and wasn't working and trying to make those adjustments to be attuned with the advisor's sentiments and needs related to those aspects. So the survey data within this theme kind of showed some significant increases in advisors' use of the reporting, which we'll look at again through the administrative records here in a bit, and especially how they're using the data to help prioritize student outreach efforts. Additionally, we saw that advisors' responses indicated a reduction in concerns related to some of the negative consequences associated with this work. Keen observers among you will notice that some of these questions are phrased in kind of a negative connotation. That was language that was adapted from the third-party resource that we pulled the survey framework from. And so we reflected that same practice in our survey to both understand where we were seeing areas of growth in a positive way, but then also where we were seeing declines that would indicate, again, kind of strong growth in positive understanding of the tool. So as an example of this, we're seeing average scores on items related to those negative effects on the advising role decreasing from 2.1 out of 7 in May to 1.6 out of 7 in November. And so that was important to see and encouraging to see, but I think it still indicates that additional work is needed to help reinforce the idea that this work is sustainable and can have a positive impact on the work of the advising team in kind of their day-to-day operations. In terms of interacting with students, we collected some additional survey data on this to understand how advisors were perceiving these tools were benefiting their work in that way. So kind of understandably, advisors expressed some initial hesitation, both via the survey and kind of face-to-face in our focus groups, about how to go about interacting with students and how they would manage those conversations, importantly, without creating a deficit mindset among learners. They didn't want to go into those conversations with the message that, hey, we're reaching out because we identified you as a student who was quote unquote at risk of not persisting. And so how do you go about managing those dynamics organically, but in a way that helps students ultimately be more successful? So we did develop some resources to try and provide kind of some standardized talking points based on literature as well as suggestions from our internal advising team. And then we developed some templates or some kind of standard email and text message language that the advisors could use to help to minimize some of those unintended consequences and use vernacular that was seen as kind of positive in nature. So the survey data that we collected within this subscale demonstrated some albeit modest increases in advisor confidence around how to interact with students and ask clarifying questions that could really help to promote stronger understanding in how they can support students and better design kind of their next steps in their academic progression. So while we have seen a little bit of movement in the belief that predictive modeling can help to benefit interactions, um, we're acknowledging that the lack of really robust change in this data suggests that there's probably still some opportunities to strengthen this area of the work specifically and help advisors feel more confident in the ways that they're interacting with students. And then the final kind of chunk of survey data was focused on information related to how advisors were perceiving this work would impact students directly. So results within this theme were pretty decidedly mixed and highlight what is likely the most significant area of focus that we'll need to really lean into as we continue to evolve this work over the next phases of this project. So while there were concerns around negative consequences for students that did drop over the course of the project, there were kind of parallel to that upticks in concerns that positive impacts would really trickle down to students, and similarly fears that students might view this work in a negative light. So these are areas that we're going to continue to really kind of dig into and pull apart and try and understand how to support advisor confidence in this space and perhaps working with students to understand what might we do and how might we serve them in a way that feels relevant and feels authentic to them. So I mentioned, in addition to the survey, that we also collected data on records of student engagement that advisors were charting in Rio Compass along the way. And so um, we saw some pretty strong trends in this, but also some results that I think parallel what we see in the survey with kind of that initial excitement and then a bit of a retraction. And I think, interestingly, now that I'm looking at this data, it kind of mirrors some of those curves that many of you have likely seen recently around the use of AI, where there's, when new technology is developed, there's an initial burst of excitement. And we see that both reflected here in the usage patterns and in the survey data. A bit of then a retraction and then a correction. And so, interestingly, paralleled here in both the survey data and the interaction records that we gleaned from Rio Compass, we're seeing some similar patterns. However, we are celebrating here that we had virtually 100% participation among advisors in charting interactions that were based on um, the predictive scores, at least by the end of the semester. Rio employs roughly 20 advisors who were dedicated to this type of advising work. And so where we're seeing upwards of 16 or 17 advisors interacting and charting interactions based on the data model, we're taking that as a sign of success that we had virtually full usage happening throughout the fall semester. And then we saw over the course of that entire study period over 1,800 contact points that were charted in Rio Compass based on the results of this data model and advisors reaching out to students. So again, a point of pride and celebration in this work. There was an average of about 116 contacts total per week that were recorded, and an average of 13 advisors per week recording those results. And so while that's not 100% participation, and while usage did certainly ebb and flow over the course of the semester, it's a strong case that the work has some potential and that we'll continue to dig into that and strengthen use case as the work continues to get refined and progressed. So to try and bookend this, the implementation of these tools that we've seen over the last 9 months or so have demonstrated some positive impact on advisors' understanding and engagement. And we saw some notable improvements in their ability to identify students who might be at risk of non-persistence and really leveraging the data that comes from the predictive model to inform their intervention work. We're hopeful that the initial training efforts that we delivered were successful in helping to increase advisors' confidence. Um, though we're noting that practical application as advisors started to really use this and engage with students in kind of a one-on-one capacity did reveal some challenges and some other skepticism related to how to make this happen in practice. Some early indicators for us in terms of success include advisors growing familiarity with the tool and its role in helping to support students, with some decreasing concerns about the potential negative impacts that they felt that they were perceiving on their role specifically. So as I mentioned, moving forward, we're certainly going to continue to refine the training, address some of those workload concerns that we saw reflected in the survey data, and continue to enhance the communication strategies that advisors might have in interacting with students to make sure that this is really a sustainable adoption moving forward. Additionally, we want to make sure that the modeling efforts that we're using are continue to be refined and making sure that the model can be kind of re-engineered and fine-tuned along the way to create stronger predictions and more confidence that the predictive scores are as accurate as possible. So the next phases of this work are certainly going to focus on stronger integration of some of those predictive analytics into the advising practices in the day-to-day space. And then hopefully that will lead to more proactive and targeted student interventions, which will drive in an ideal world, kind of that increase in student persistence over time at the college. For me, let me know. Do you want to jump back in here on these kind of lessons learned, or do you want to jump back in on that next slide on next steps?
Yeah,
Okay,
jump in the next one, yeah.
so I covered some of this in those comments that I was just making, but certainly the lessons that we learned and things that we would hope other institutions who might want to engage in a similar body of work would take from this would be the implementation of these early alert tools really highlighted for us the need for really intentional collaborative efforts with this along the way. Initially in this work, we were somewhat naive in thinking that everybody would be on board with this because why not? It's going to be great, right? But it really took time to sit with and advocate for uh, and make the case for the need for this type of work. And ultimately, I think we were able to start to make some inroads there, but we have some more work to do. Um, we did see that advisors demonstrated increased understanding and kind of confidence in the work, but there was still some resistance. And even though theoretically I think folks are on board with the idea, the practical day-to-day applications did present some barriers. And so those are things that we still need to work through, specifically around how we're communicating with students based on these things and a need to reinforce that after interventions happen, that there is a successful outcome for students on the back end of that work. Um, we did see that the most benefit that we could have for our staff who are using this was to kind of scaffold that learning and not try and deliver too much too soon. We didn't want to have kind of a drinking from the fire hose effect where people were trying to understand the model and understand how to interact with students. And so a phased approach to that implementation effort is certainly something that we're recommending, as well as um, really strengthening communication strategies on the front end. I think we set advisors up for a bit of a mixed bag of outcomes because even though we felt really confident in the initial data that we were presenting to them, and we're confident that uh, students would be appreciative of this as they went in and started working with it day to day, we realized that there were some things that we hadn't considered and certainly making note of those things earlier on and coming up with strategies to help the advisors feel comfortable and confident going into those conversations is something that is a strong recommendation coming out of this body of work. All right, Fermin, back to you.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just gonna take it a little bit back on history, just
Sure.
just to hit on what Zach was saying, right? We had the experience with Rio Pace. We had a lot of issues where people didn't have faith on it, that people didn't want the system going going. They didn't think it would work. And we had meetings every 2 weeks trying to convince people that we needed some patience and things would eventually work. If history does any good for me, we are here, right? Right now, we track of more than 50% of the courses already. So there is a lesson on the difficulties that come up when trying to do a new initiative, but there is also a positive lesson that eventually people see the benefit. And the benefit is we want to have a favorable impact on student behavior, on student success, on student persistence, on student retention, just to name a few words, right? So in that sense, we the curve now is not as steep as the curve that we had before. And that's to the credit of the advisors, their willingness, despite not having 100% trust on the idea and on the tool, they have gone along and results, while not perfect, they are encouraging, right? Now, how do we move forward, right? On the bullet number one, right? What we want to do is just develop more trust on the tools so advisors will have greater confidence when they use the tool, right? So that's a challenge that I take personally, and Zach said about, you know, improving the model predictability, improving the scores, making them more accurate, maybe create new variables, right? That's one thing that we have to do going forward. Now, how do we build that trust? I think the lesson it's already on these charts here, right? We might have to again go back to the sandbox, revisit the issues with advisors, give them additional explanations as to what has been done lately. I think that's very important. Telling faculty also what we are doing, trying to build that trust. That's one way that we can minimize the negative impact and give them greater confidence that the tool will do benefit for them, for the students, and for the college, right? So there is another issue of data. Most of the data that we have is what I would call transactional data. What do I mean by that? Well, these are credits, these are their demographics, right? But we don't have a record on what happens with our students at this level. By that I mean they are taking care of a mom, they're taking care of a child, maybe the car broke down, maybe they can't put food on the table on that day, maybe instead of working part-time, then they work full-time now. So they have all these load behind in their shoulders. And then on top of that, they need to keep up with their school because that's what will make a difference in how they make a living in the future. So we don't have data on that. That will be something that if we ever get a hold on it, it will basically allow us to tailor interventions and support more adequate to fit the particular needs. And that to me would have probably much more impact on whether they persist or not going forward. In terms of what can we do to have mechanisms that will establish trust, well, the mechanisms again would have to be something that we initially envisioned with this project. But given how they changed the time frame, we couldn't do it. In other words, we wanted to look at, okay, is the tool really making a difference on student persistence or not? Right? And that required a different type of approach than the one that we're using here. Because in here, we are focusing more on eliminating the doubts that advisors have, while in the other bigger picture was to look at, okay, how does the model predict that the students will persist? And at the end, let's say at the end of a term, the whole analysis is let's look at see who actually persisted. And then let's look at the ones that did not persist and look at the reasons as to why they did not persist. And that was the piece that we wanted to look at it, but we need a longer time frame and better data collection in order to arrive at that conclusion. But that's the next stage where we plan to move going forward. In terms of what policies can institutions put in place, right? It's all embedded in all the things that we talk about. Right? This is something new. We haven't done it. I haven't done a model of this type ever, right? And the literature out there is not very rich in terms of telling you how to go about it, much less how to put it into production. Because this thing is in production now. It runs every day in the server. every day generates prediction probability scores. Then the reporting side comes into play, and the reports are distributed to advisors, and advisors decide how to proceed in each particular case. This is all brand new to us, and we will continue improving as we move along. Myself, from the modeling aspect, is like I said, exploring better prediction accuracy by creating additional variables. If you want to call it fancier, future engineering. If you want to call prediction model, machine learning models. But it's basically just a model that has a bunch of attributes trying to capture the student behavior and assign a probability. That's in essence a model. Can call it fancy names, but fancy names, it's just that. At the end of the day, all we want to do is pick the best attributes that will identify whether the students will persist or not. And I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks for ending us on those thoughts for me. I'd be remiss if I didn't thank everybody who's been a part of this project, and there's too many people to name them by name because I will inevitably forget somebody, but this certainly was not just Fermin and I's work, although Fermin's data modeling was the foundation and the bedrock from which all this kind of started. But the advisement team has been a tremendous partner in this. I know Jennifer is on the call, and she was certainly instrumental in helping to help get the feedback that we needed to continue to refine and make this better over time, as was the rest of the team. Um, Anyone who helped contribute to this, we thank along the way. There was an advisory team that we pulled together, kind of a cross-functional group with Jennifer and her counterparts in the advising office. We had a faculty member. We had some folks from marketing to think about student communications and all those things. And so, this took a village, and the work is not done, but we're super excited to have gotten it to this point to really test out that this can work and to have some data that's showing us some early signs that there is value here, and as this continues to evolve and be refined, that it can have an effect on our students' journeys here at Rio Salado. So thank you all so much for joining us and learning about this today. We have some time for questions if anybody is interested in hanging out and kind of having a conversation about that. But otherwise, just appreciate your attention and participation today. And thank you so much for being a part of our community.